day, everybody. Hi, are we together? I don't see anybody. I'm not sure if we're all here. I'm going to thank you. Today I'm sure you've just come from your previous sessions. The one session just ended like 30 seconds ago. I hope you've had a comfort break and you ready for this session. Our panel is panel 4, and our title is Humanizing Food Justice Politics. We have 3 presenters, and I'd ask them to just so that you can see them. I'm not sure where you were, but I was in breakout room 1 earlier, and it was a fascinating discussion, very interesting and rich. I hope you managed to come back into the space and ready for the rest of us. Thank you very much. So we have Tinashe, who will join us today, and Feranaaz and Tjale. The 3 of them will be presenting, and the session, I'm sure, is going to be identical to the one before. Each of them will get an opportunity to share with us, and then we'll have a few minutes of questions and answers, and then we'll hopefully get together at the end and then have a broader discussion. So we're really looking forward to everybody being here. If you ready and off I saw these rooms and these tables earlier. I don't know if everybody tried it, but I was trying to pop from one room to another room, Tinashe, and I was going to another Tinashe and not you. So I'm looking forward to the session with everybody. So welcome, and Tinashe will start first. Tinashe will be talking about, and then of course, I don't know if any of you seen the program, if you've had a chance to look at the program today, the booklet. It's fantastic actually. And our session starts from page 29 for everybody that's in the room. And from page 29, the titles are there, but also people's abstracts. So, you know, if you haven't managed to look at it and you'd like to be able to follow up, you'd be able to find that there. So Tinashe, over to you. Thank you to Feranaaz and Tjale. I'll have Tinashe over onto the screen now, if that's okay. And you'll be talking about cultivating food justice and a case for urban community gardens in the Cape Flats. Thank you. Over to you, Tinashe.
Good day, everyone. The title of my talk today is Cultivating Food Justice, a re-examination of urban community gardens in the Cape Flats. My presentation will be structured as follows. Background, aim, conceptualization, study area, methods, findings, challenges, and I'll provide a brief conclusion. To start off, neoliberalism is generally used to describe an ideological set of ideas that favor capital accumulation by protecting the free trade market system and the erosion of welfare. This system was sold as a system that's able to promote individual freedom by liberalizing the market. However, a closer look at the system indicates that freedom only becomes freedom for the wealthy, hence is not emancipatory at all. The implementation of neoliberal-based ideologies has affected every aspect of life, including the food we consume. The food system as we know it has been monopolized by few corporations that control every aspect of the food system, from the production, processing, and distribution of food. Over the course of time, these systems have destroyed livelihoods of smallholder farmers and the environment as well. However, these have not gone unchallenged. In response to the inadequacies of the system, there has been various movements across the globe that seek to counter the system to promote more equitable access to food. Such movements include the food sovereignty and the food justice movements. While these movements are generally all geared towards the transformation of the food system, they do differ a bit in terms of their approach. The food sovereignty movement, for instance, is a rather radical approach that calls for the overhaul of the food system, whereas the food justice movement is a rather progressive approach focused on more localized efforts to transform the food system. Hence, food justice, the focus of this talk, emanates in many ways that target various aspects of the food system. For instance, food production. Hence, urban community gardens present a tool to drive food justice. In fact, the literature is quite clear in indicating that food gardens possess the capacity to counter the neoliberal food system through the localized production, processing, and distribution of healthier food options for local communities. Therefore, it was through this lens that the study was conducted, viewing gardens as a tool to counter the neoliberal food system in South Africa, but more specifically in Cape Town, because there has been limited studies that focus on these issues, especially in a global South context. So my study was an attempt to add to this gap in the knowledge. I should highlight that the study is part of a broader PhD work that focuses on how urban community gardens address various injustices within distressed neighborhoods in Cape Town. However, today my talk will be focusing on one of the many objectives of that broader study. So the talk today will specifically focus on investigating how urban community gardens in Cape Town are challenging the neoliberal food system. Of conceptualization. I conceptualized the study looking at gardening as a form of activism. So activism generally describes actions aimed at influencing social change. There is a lot of literature that has examined different forms of activism. However, it is clear that most of such literature usually presents activism as a form of visible and heroic act that usually occurs on a large scale. For instance, this could be riots and massive strikes. I mean, when you do think about it, in the mainstream, when people think about activism, this is the kind of imagery that comes to mind, where it's apparent in terms of like the number of individuals there, the magnitude of the actions, as well as the results that follow. However, more contemporary literature broadens our understanding of activism and shows that activism is not always so overt, but can actually exist in different subtle forms as well. So for instance, when you look at urban agriculture and urban community gardens, more specifically, these are viewed as a form of quiet activism, because although they're not vocal, they can, in their small ways, contribute to progressive change in addressing various problems which are faced within these distressed communities. So this is the lens through which I conceptualized the study. In terms of the study area, the study took place on the Cape Flats in Cape Town. This is generally an area of high density formal and informal housing located between Cape Town's wealthy and northern suburbs. The area is primarily populated by the Black and colored communities, where work is generally scarce with very high unemployment rates in these areas. Cape Town, like the rest of the cities in the country, is influenced by neoliberal policies. Perhaps at a national level, this was seen when the country decided to adopt the growth, employment, and redistribution strategy in 1996. So since then, there has been an increasing gap between, rather that gap has been maintained between the rich and the poor, and this has barely been addressed. So for instance, inequality is very high in South Africa by most metrics. But when you look at the Gini coefficient, it has been around 0.6 since independence. So it's clear that issues of poverty are quite structural, and little has been done to address this. The same goes for the food system, where we have a few companies which run the system, which was the same thing before the country got its independence. Today, still, a recent Oxfam report reports that about 60% of the country's markets is controlled by 5 corporations. As a result, the food supply and distribution system continues to marginalize small-scale producers and suppliers. There's also unequal access to supermarkets and healthy food options across the neighborhoods in the city. Despite the rapid expansion of supermarkets into low-income areas, a lot of studies continue to show that the food options available in the supermarkets are different compared to those in wealthier neighborhoods. Perhaps more detrimental is the manner in which large-scale food corporations have managed to transform consumer dietary patterns by the provision of highly processed, calorie-dense food options. So it's really not surprised that we have problems, various illnesses such as diabetes and high blood pressure in these distressed communities. And then we go on to term these lifestyle choice related diseases when in fact these are the only food options available to people in these spaces. In terms of the methods utilized, I used a mixed methods research approach to conduct the broader study where gardens were purposefully selected on the Cape Flats. The community gardens were the sampling unit of the study, and 34 gardens were selected through purposive means, but also through snowballing. This was to ensure that not only gardens supported by civil society actors were able to be accessed. Right? So the NPOs were the point of contact to identify the first few gardens which were utilized in the study. At the end of the day, a total of 96 questionnaires were administered across the 34 gardens, with 34 semi-structured interviews, which were targeting the lead gardeners of each garden. In addition to this, key informant interviews were conducted with stakeholders which support urban agriculture in these gardens, and these range from the City of Cape Town, the Provincial Department of Agriculture, and a number of civil society actors. That data was collected through various means, as already mentioned, and due to COVID, some were conducted online or through telephonic means and so forth. All ethical protocol was observed, and the data was analyzed accordingly. For instance, qualitative descriptive stats was utilized, and for the qualitative data from the interviews, thematic analysis was utilized. Now I'm going to move on to the findings. The figure before you just shows the distribution of the urban community gardens on the Cape Flats across the different neighborhoods. As you can see, most of the gardens are largely concentrated in the areas of Kailicha and Nyanga, and we have a few in Guguletu, some in Ottery, and some in Mitchell's Plain. In terms of demographics, the majority of the participants are female, mostly above 60 years of age. This is the current trends as you would find in the literature, where the elderly are actually the ones dominating urban community gardens. However, it was quite encouraging to see that about 20% were below the age of 36, and actually half of these were below the age of 29. So there is some youth which are involved in these gardens as well. There has been a discussion around this, and it was quite promising to see that the youth are generally also involved to some extent in these activities. Most of the gardeners were born in other regions or provinces of the country and had moved to Cape Town, but had been living in Cape Town for at least 10 years. When gardeners were asked to indicate their motivations behind gardening, it was clear that the motivations were multiple. So as you can see from the table before you, a multiple response analysis was used to identify which categories the participants were comfortable with. And it showed that most of them engage in gardening for multiple reasons. And it's not just for food security and nutrition, as the literature would want to suggest, right? So this also allowed me to then try and understand why the motivations were varied. And it was quite clear to see that there has been a rise in the number of NPOs operating in Cape Town over the years. So graph that shows the number of organizations that have been in operation on the Cape Flats supporting urban agricultural activities. These are just the ones that I was able to identify. I'm sure there are more out there. So this generally shows that, there's a lot of these organizations which support urban agriculture activities in the area, and they usually have different aims. So as you can see, the aims before you, they're quite diverse. And one argument I make in the broader work is the emergence of a number of these civil society actors has to some extent influenced the conscientization of the urban gardeners on various issues, which also include food rights and food justice within these communities. Right. Now, the manner through which urban community gardens are promoting food justice can be classified, or according to my findings, I was able to classify them under three main interrelated themes, which include access to food, the promoting of alternative food systems, and the decommodification of food. However, today I'll only focus on the second theme, right, which is promoting alternative food systems. So in terms of promoting alternative food systems, what we mean by this is these gardeners or gardens, they are spaces which cultivate a lot of ideas about food rights and food justice within these communities. So these spaces, they are breeding grounds for all the ideas that they then seek to disseminate, not only to the gardeners, but also to the community. So you'd find that a lot of these gardens are connected to a number of activist groups, global as well. For instance, the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign or the Slow Food Movement. So they have links with such organizations, and there is a continuous dissemination of information from activist groups to the gardens. And in turn, these gardens are a breeding ground of these ideas, which they then share with other members of the gardens, as well as the community at large. So you find that there are certain gardens that engage in conducting workshops where they try to educate the community on issues of food justice or the need to know where your food is coming from. And by default of the location of the gardens are able to share this information with school children, because most of those community gardens are located on school land, and this offers the perfect recipe of promoting the educational aspects of urban gardening. And it's in most cases not just about the food in itself, but it's about what that food can do to improve the situation in these areas. So that's quite a crucial point, which links to the next point as well in terms of promoting alternative food systems. So as I've mentioned, they take this beyond the garden. And what I mean by that is these gardeners are now organized into formal and informal networks, which have a specific purpose, amongst others, to promote food justice within their communities. So we have urban gardener networks that are emerging in these townships, and I will be focusing on one today. The two that I identified is the Guguletu Urban Farmers Initiatives, also known as GUFI, and the Western Cape Urban Farmers Initiative. But I'll be looking at the first one, which is GUFI. So the Guguletu Urban Farmers Initiative was created within the midst of the pandemic last year. Their aim includes creating backyard and community gardens in order for the local community to become self-sustainable and be able to eat nutritional food. And also, it 6 to 10 Guguletu, which is the township in which it was formed, into a food forest in a progressive manner. In their own ways, I quote, house by house, street by street, area by area. So it is quite clear that they have a broader vision of changing their neighborhood into something they see as like a food forest, where everyone is conscious about the food they eat. They are making wiser options about what they buy or what they choose to consume, right? So in promoting their activities, they engage in a lot of to promote their aims, they engage in a lot of activities. For instance, the mobilization of backyard gardeners and community gardeners through what they call Ilima projects, where the gardeners assist each other in the gardens to promote the activities and show, the ability to improve social capital in the neighborhood, and also share the ideas that they have as gardeners. They're also aiming to formalize themselves into a functional body with a clear structure and management system, where they can conduct more structured workshops for their members and supply them with the skills they need. Ultimately, their aim is to effectively also lobby for the needs of the urban gardeners, the necessary stakeholders, for instance, the government. This is quite important, especially in the context of COVID, where it was quite clear that the food system as it is inadequate and inefficient for a lot. So that triggered a lot of, or it's kind of like re-energized different stakeholders to come to the table again and have discussions around the food system. So it helps that the gardeners are now having this form of movements where they can then be a part of these conversations and clearly articulate their viewpoints and where they stand in terms of the food system in Cape Town particularly. So this is one example of urban gardeners organizing to promote food justice within their community. They're quite passionate about their work and they're engaged in a lot of activities, not just the gardening aspect, but as you can see, they do actually have placards and they want the people to know where their food is coming from. Know your farmer, know your food. That's quite important to them and they're passionate about these things. But as with anything, there is always challenges involved. I do realize that there are a number of challenges involved in ensuring the success of these movements. However, today I'm going to just focus on two because of time. So the first one is the coordination of activities. So indeed, whilst I appreciate that there are a lot of these small movements breeding from these spaces, one thing that's clear is they are not well coordinated. So the coordination is quite important as it would improve, the voice of the gardeners from a broader context. However, what's happening now is there's movements are happening in small clusters, and in some cases they don't speak to each other. In some cases they do, which is good, as that's what's required for the growth to eventually happen. So that would be like one key challenge that I noticed, that there still is a need for them to talk to each other and find places of interest where they can converge and create perhaps bigger groups, right? Then the next challenge is the issue of the sustainability of the community gardens themselves. So as I've already said, the visibility of these spaces are quite crucial. So they need to be in existence because this is the space where all these ideas are cultivated and disseminated to the rest of the community. But the gardens do suffer from land tenure security. It's very high and it's difficult for gardeners to have a guaranteed status in terms of like the sustainability of the garden. So as you can see from the figure before you, it shows you the land tenure status or where most of the gardens are located. So as you can see, most of the gardens are located on school land and public land. A few are on private land, which is owned by certain individuals. And those are the most secure, I would say, in terms of like tenure security. The rest, it's really difficult. Even on school land, you are never really sure when your time is up. So there are a lot of gardens which I termed migratory gardens, which have moved from their original area of establishment because of land tenure security reasons. So you can only imagine how many gardens have actually been terminated because of such issues. And with that termination, there's a termination of that zeal and those ideas which are being brewed in some of these gardens, which are fighting for these issues in their communities. Right. So this is quite a problem when you look at it in the broader context of the sustainability or the continuation of such movements. Right. To conclude, the findings indicate that we have progressive spaces in these townships where issues of food justice are being cultivated amongst those individuals interested. So from a geographical point of view, which is my discipline, such spaces are indeed transformative in the sense that they are being used to a specific end, the end being to cultivate individuals who stand for specific ideals in these communities. This slow but steady growth in food-conscious gardeners engaging in various food movements to promote food justice is actually in line with the literature that indicates that gardening can be viewed as a form of quiet activism against the neoliberal food system. However, there are indeed a number of problems which limit these activities, and these are, of course, brought to the fore because of the contradictory nature of the garden's existence within a neoliberal environment. Right? Nevertheless, however small or routine these actions are, they need to be fully acknowledged as progressive and having the potential to change the food system it could be a slow way, but it's important that these people are active consumers within the system rather than passive, because once everyone is active and conscious, as you would know, then it breeds the ground for easier I would say like it's easier for them to move forward or take forward their ideas and bring about the change that they require. I'd like to thank you for your time. That's the end of my presentation. You are muted, Donna.
Thank you very much, Tinashe. Thank you so much, everybody. Tinashe, hopefully you and I can be on the same screen and we can see each other while if there are any questions and comments in relation to I see you're getting lots of applause, which is great. Thank you very much, Tinashe. I think that was really, really interesting. Thank you for being able to condense all of that in such a short space of time. And I'm going to open up for questions. I just maybe two things. I mean, I think the idea of gardening as a form of activism is really important and interesting. But there's something more that you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that you're talking about a particular type of activism. You're talking about the silent activism. Maybe you can say something a little more about that, and then how that connects to the example that the Guguletu Urban Food Farmers Initiative specifically, because you're talking about house to house, if I understood the quote correctly, house to house, house for house, community to community. And so what's the nature of the silent activism in that act? Is perhaps one of the things that struck me in what you were saying, and then maybe linked to, I think Limpopo raised something, and maybe it's the question that you've raised about the challenges. You wrote that, or you phrased it as sustainability of common gardens and community gardens, and I think when I originally saw the sustainability, I didn't think of it in relation to the question of land, and you've raised it in the context of land specifically in an area like Guguletu, which is very dense, etc. So I'm going to give you an opportunity, and then if anybody else wants to add or say something, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think to respond to the first part of the question in terms of like activism. So I did struggle with, finding out what's the best term to use, whether it's activism or resistance. What I found in the literature is, activism, I think, is a more appropriate term, because activism is not just about like the visible heroic acts, as I was trying to point out, but it's also like the small yet routine things that happen from day to day. So the mere effect of a gardener, of me as a gardener, influencing you to garden under the understanding that, you need to know where food is coming from. That in itself is a form of activism, which is not, the same as, the usual forms of activism we are aware of as society. So that is what I was trying to put across, to say it's not only, the outright kind of activities, but yes, definitely there are some gardens, because these are 34 gardens, and across 34 gardens in the broader study, I do try and find them to say there are some more, the activism is out there compared to others, which are sort of like doing the quiet kind of activism. So the Goofy definitely is out there, because they are out there and they're holding the cards and they're marching and they're making a statement within the community. So that would be a different form of activism compared to, say, people who are just concerned about maybe holding workshops where they're educating the people and trying to persuade them to change their lifestyles in certain ways. So I think that's the issue in terms of the activist viewpoint of land. As you would know, in Cape Town or South Africa in general, the issue of land is quite topical. So those community gardens are not, the usual community gardens that come to mind when people think of community gardens, say in the global south. Because in the global south, I think they think of, public parks open and they're given the land by the city and they're able to use that land for cultivating. So it's a bit of it's not the same picture, if I would say, in South Africa. So you have community gardens that are not only on public land, but we have community gardens where people ask for land from like a school or like from a church, or even like from a private landowner, and then they cultivate there as a group. Some it's as a group, but like even as a group, they still have allotment plots on that same land. So all these dynamics were quite important for me to capture, as they do influence how then they go about the activities and the broader aims and the visions of the garden as a unit. Yeah, I see there
Thank
are a lot of
you.
comments.
Yes, are you seeing your comments and your questions over there, Tinashe?
Yeah.
Maybe you could thread that together. There's and you can choose. There's a combination of questions in relation to the point about know your farmer, know your food, and specifically about the type of plants that are there. This chat is going, is very busy. There's a question about the bylaws as well. To the next question in relation to the gardens are also, community gardens are also supported by the City of Cape Town. So I'm maybe Lynn wants to say something more, or you want to say something more in relation to that. But the point that if I understood correctly that you were making was that in the north, and the literature also speaks about that, is about allotments and the commoning of certain areas, which isn't necessarily the case. As I'm familiar with in Google Earth, and of course you're very familiar, so maybe you can say something to that, and of course you see all the comments. So I'm going to give you 2-3 more minutes, and then I'm going to move us on. And everybody, we come back for 10-15 minutes with everybody. So I'm sorry if we haven't been able to get through all of this. Go ahead, Tinashe. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, Cape Town is quite different. The comments are coming through. Definitely, there are a lot of gardens which are supported by the City of Cape Town. But what my study has realized is, that the form of support and all of that, there are specific conditions that are required for you to be able to receive the support from the city and from the Department of Agriculture. So in a way, the state has oppressed, or it's controlling where these gardens emerge, because it's difficult for you to get support if you're on an open piece of land. So if you illegally occupy an open space, you're not going to get support, and that's going to force you to look for space like on schools. So one thing that my study sees is that most of the gardens are located on school land, and it's not by choice, but they know that it's difficult to get access to a lease from the city, for example, or from the government responsible for that piece of land. So what they choose to do is, even before going to look for this land, the open space, they rather go to a school. And there are cases where you have someone cultivating on school land, and adjacent to the school there is an open area and it's not in use. So that just shows, the some of those dynamics I'm talking about, to say, they are in a way controlling this. They do support, and the city different policies in the past. For instance, the urban agricultural policy of 2007, and then now they have the food gardens policy, where they support in the form of inputs. But in terms of like provision of land, it's never really happened on a scale that they had promised in the urban agricultural policy. So the issue of land is, there's always red tape involved, and it's never clear to say, you can actually obtain land. Look, if there's more comments there. Okay, I see Tinashe says.
Thanks,
Yes.
Tinashe.
Yeah.
You can scan a bit later, and then we can come back to it. But
Okay.
Just to connect that, I think that what's really interesting is the point about that you made at the beginning about gardening. They have community gardens for multiple reasons, and so perhaps later you can link that to the multiple reasons. That's the one thing. And then that takes us almost into the second presentation, which is about the question that you're raising in relation to land and access, which is about today's class and gender, because I would really be interested to know who are these people in the community gardens and how they're getting access and support depending on what. So could they, if the multiple reasons are not because we want to feed ourselves, but the multiple reasons are, for instance, just being and communing and the well-being that comes from community gardens, is that supported? Thank you, Tinashe. You can see there are many comments, and I have to move on. But well done. Thank you very much. Tinashe was very nervous joining us. He was waiting in room 2, breakaway to room 2. I hope you don't mind me saying, Tinashe. So well done, Tinashe. We're going to move on to the next presentation. And it's breastfeeding as a form of food work, considering work family. race, gender, and class. And Feranaaz is our presenter. Welcome, Feranaaz. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Donna.
Over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. As Donna mentioned, my name is Feranaaz Farista. I'm an organizational psychology master's student at the University of Cape Town, and I'll be presenting on my dissertation topic that was created by both myself and my supervisor, Dr. Ameeta Jaga, breastfeeding as a form of food work considering race, gender, and class. A bit of a background and rationale to my study is that my study really sought to expand our understanding of breastfeeding as a form of food work that lactating mothers in paid employment perform, and really by conceptualizing how race, gender, and class intersect to shape these experiences of low-income Black women in the context of Cape Town, South Africa. Lactating mothers that are marginalized at the intersections of their race, gender, and class, particularly those who are Black and who work in low-income jobs, may struggle to meet these ideals of being a good mother and a good worker simultaneously due to their conflicting role demands. For example, lactating mothers may need to regularly express breast milk or breastfeed their infant during working hours, which causes their food work role to compete with their work demands. These demands could result in mothers letting their food work role take a back foot and let their work demands really take precedence over their food work. Low-income Black mothers are really exposed to various complexities in the workplace due to their interlocking social identities. They navigate an organizational context that views them as sort of deviating from the social norm, and they also navigate a societal context that views their intersecting identities of being Black and being poor as making them incapable of good child rearing. Low-income mothers often struggle to reconcile mothering and employment with their breastfeeding, as they sometimes lack the autonomy and the bargaining capacity, and even just the will sometimes to really negotiate these breastfeeding terms with their employer out of fear of really losing their jobs, which means that they struggle to meet the World Health Organization's recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of an infant's life. While under the tenets of intensive mothering, they indicate that women should enact these food work duties, this often sets unattainable markers for many women due to their lived material realities. So this research and literature really leads me to my following main research question. How is breastfeeding as a form of food work experienced and managed among low-income working mothers in South Africa? And my sub-question, which is how are the mothers' identities of race, gender, and social class implicated in their themes? So moving on to my methods section, to explore my research question, I used a qualitative research approach, and this was really used to get an in-depth understanding of these lactating women's experiences. To aid in my understanding of the topic, I used intersectionality, and this was guided by role theory as well. So role theory is really premised on this idea that working family role demands compete for finite resources, such as time, and this can result in personal strain or role pressure. However, despite these lived experiences really being dependent on context and intersectional lens often. Intersectionality, on the other hand, is this idea that race, gender, class, and other social identities intersect, and these create and shape human experiences, and this can create interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. For my study, I used a secondary data analysis approach, and this was using data from the Stumbits and Jaga 2020 study. I specifically selected this approach as there was a lack of theory and literature on the research topic, and also given that the appropriate themes related to food work, intersectionality, and role demands really emerged in that primary data set. To collect that primary data, the researchers had used two non-probability sampling strategies, those of purposive and snowball sampling, and this sampling technique yielded a sample of 36 low-paid mothers between the ages of 23 to 45 years old, and who earned less than 4,500 Rand a month, and who identified as either African, Black, or as coloured. These women worked in a variety of industries, such as retail, domestic workers, factories, and they were all should have been covered by maternity protection legislation, as they were all employed in the formal sector. Data was collected from these women through face-to-face, semi-structured, in-depth interviews, and this was really used to create a very informal, flexible, and collaborative interview style. And to analyze this data, I used Ball and Clark's 6-step guide to thematic analysis. Moving on to my analysis and discussion section. So my first theme, named Foodwork Experiences and Precarity in the Workplace, really referred to the difficult low-income work context that these women were exposed to, which made it hard for them to breastfeed. A 39-year-old mother who worked as a domestic worker explained, "I was feeling scared. Sometimes she, the employer, was promising me she was going to fire me. She is complaining, so I feel scared. When she comes back, when I heard there is a sound for the car outside, then I start to run and then take my bottles of pumped milk, and then I put it in my bag." The second extract also really captures the theme, and this woman who was, she was a 45-year-old mother and working as a sales assistant, and she said, "The thing is just that one day he, the boss, saw a bottle, the milk in a work freezer, so he freaked out when he saw that he was like, I don't want to see this again, whatever," laughs. "People don't want to see breast milk lying anywhere. It's like it's dirty. That's how they see it, like someone just squeezed it. I think they don't understand the concept of covering a bottle in a plastic bag. It's not like it's going to affect other foods in the freezer. Maybe they are scared that the hormones will come out and go into the smoothie," laughs. Both of these mothers really shared the challenges of being intimidated in their wage labor roles. They feared that they would lose their job due to their foodwork duties. The second extract really highlights that breastfeeding was actually considered dirty, unsanitary in the workplace, and the low-income context was not suitable for this mother's foodwork. Putting breast milk in a communal freezer was seen as very taboo and wrong. And this really highlights how the organizational context is understood in masculine terms that do not fit with breastfeeding and foodwork. And this is consistent with other scholars' findings who also found that mothers would attempt to hide their foodwork duties in the workplace or really hide that leaky state, to ensure that they remained good workers. 2 studies by Cebisa, for example, found that pregnant women and lactating mothers participated in taxing maternal bodywork in an attempt to disguise the effect that lactation had on their bodies, so that they maintained their position as a professional worker, which really shows how foodwork was incompatible in the work environment. Moving on to my second theme, structural inequalities in foodwork. This theme really relates and reflects the financial challenges that these women were exposed to, and this related to their low income work, being responsible for the household, and also handling an unsafe commute to work. And all of these structural inequalities and challenges really shaped their foodwork experiences. The first extract by a 34-year-old mother working as a packer in a clothing factory and a food retail cashier explained, "They, the employer, gave me maternity leave for 4 months, but I couldn't take the whole 4 months because I'm the only one who's working. Then I decided, let me go back early. Because the kids, we didn't have enough food. I have to rent, I have to buy food. I'm the only one who is working." The second mother outlined, who's 23 years old, working as a sales assistant, outlined, "I have a child and it's the company closing late. We were closing at 10 p.m. and that was in Belleville. So I have to get home late sometimes, waiting for the transport as well, and getting home at sometimes after 12 p.m. because my transport was not only just picking me up." By holding these intersecting identities of Black and low social caste, these mothers were forced to leave their infant at a very early age, as staying at home after childbirth was not amenable to a financially stable household. Yet commuting to and from work was also something very challenging for these mothers and unsafe at times. 2 scholars also found that low-income South African mothers really were forced to return to work soon after childbirth because they experienced a lot of financial strain from staying at home, exposing the real class differences in their experiences. For example, other scholars have found that class-privileged mothers that working at a more middle to high income level could afford financially indulgent options like taking additional leave or staying at home and resigning really after after they gave birth to ensure that they could enact the foodwork duties and really absorb their time as a mother. However, these low-income workers didn't have these kinds of options, showing the real class differences in their experiences. Another thing that's also important to note is that middle and high-income workers are typically also in a more conducive and supportive work environment, which makes them more able to balance the food work and the mothering and the employment, but this wasn't possible for these low-income workers. My third theme, gender norms and social class, shaping childcare and food work, really outlines the challenges and the complexities of being positioned as a woman in a very patriarchal culture, as well as the influence of clan cultural values and how these shape food work experiences. A 45-year-old mother working as a private cleaner at a government hospital and who also conducted food manufacturing explained, the child is the mother's responsibility. Your child is crying, come take, it's your child. You know, the African people are so stubborn, there are rules for each, like men must do this and women must do that. They put the role of taking care of the child on the mother only. A second extract outlined by a 26-year-old working as a machinist, she explained, I have a mother who is very old school. She would give my child food from 3 months. She would give like a scoop, 2 scoops of porridge, 1 yogurt per day. By the age of 5 months, she would give solid food from the pot. My mother would say, the child is hungry. I will feed the child now. The first interviewer's experience really captured her frustration that South African families tend to perceive the mother as the sole caregiver and child rearer, as they are more innately nurturing, while the fathers really hold the position of power in society as they are the providers. This is consistent with other scholars who also found that traditional gender norms really shape childcare practices and also food work duties, and more often than not, it would fall on the mother for these kinds of responsibilities. The second mother interestingly explores the class issues which came about of these women's race and class positioning. As they are low-income workers and they really relied on their family for unpaid childcare, their family had a significant influence over the food work and mothering techniques. So, for example, in African families, the culture is very much a clan cultural value, which means that every member of the clan has a right to advise other clan members, to influence decisions and to give their input. These women noted throughout the interviews that their mothers either knew better, that they were old school, which indicated that they really respected them and valued their cultural beliefs. However, it's possible that to appear grateful and to appear respectful for the unpaid childcare they were getting, these women's food work choices were also somewhat shaped and influenced by family members. So while Western families that are more middle to high income were really forced to maybe obey other mothers' wishes in terms of their food work, based on other scholars' findings, low-income workers often lack this because of the clan cultural values and how this shaped food work choices. My fourth and final theme, medical discourse as pathologizing Black low-income mothers' food work knowledges, really referred to the fact that the community struggled to understand the health perspective of breastfeeding. You know, they were given these ideas of breast is best, but they weren't actually informed why. They didn't know why it was necessary. It was just kind of messaging at a very basic level. This meant that women were often chose to follow local knowledge systems and family and around breastfeeding and feed work, as they deemed it more legitimate than the health discourse, which they had minimal information about, which highlighted a sort of disconnect between the health perspective of breastfeeding and local knowledge systems. For example, a 45-year-old mother working as a private cleaner at a government hospital explained, from the first month, you must give your child water. You must obviously boil the water and throw like a little bit of gripe water. The water cleanses the child from the inside. The infant, would get like this pink pimples from breast milk. The 29-year-old working as a machinist in a clothing factory outlined, the clinic, they do give flyers there, but people must take their own pamphlets and it's not explained. The community needs to do something. That's where the local radios and the local newspapers come in. This mother really noted that people were given pamphlets about breastfeeding. They had to go and take it themselves, but breastfeeding was not something that was really accessible to the community in terms of community members who struggled to understand English or who didn't know how to read. The messaging really needed to be in an ethnic language, according to this mother, and advertised on local radios and newspapers so that the breastfeeding message could be easily understood. Many individuals really chose to follow local knowledge systems which they deemed to be legitimate to gain greater insight into breastfeeding and foodwork practices. This really highlighted a disconnect between the health discourse of breastfeeding and local knowledge systems. Notions of these ideal feeding techniques and breast is best were sort of superficially advertised in the community, which meant that many mothers chose to follow their own local knowledge systems and their own foodwork choices that they perceived to be well established by the community and family members. So while the health perspective of breastfeeding may mandate exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of an infant's life, unilaterally applying this without the right sort of messaging may not fit in a South African context. For example, like the first mother explained, there's traditions like water and gripe water, which are seen to have healing properties and benefits for the infant that breast milk doesn't have. And this woman struggled to find the disconnect between being encouraged and almost forced to breastfeed, as opposed to also implementing her own cultural values in her foodwork techniques. These themes that emerged really highlighted the need to consider breastfeeding as a form of foodwork and as a labor of foodwork, and to consider how local knowledge systems and contextualities shape low-income Black workers' foodwork experiences. The influences of gender, race, and social class cannot be divided from the topic of foodwork, as social location creates independent systems which really shape employment and foodwork demands. I'd just like to take a moment to really thank all the women who participated in the study and who shared their stories so willingly. I'd also like to thank my incredible supervisor, Dr. Ameeta Jaga, for sharing her experiences and expertise in this topic, the NRF and UCT Research Committee for their funding of this project, as well as TVN Consultancy for their assistance. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to any of your comments and questions.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I see you getting thumbs up, and I don't know if you can see what I see, and clapping, etc. Thank you very much for. There was a lot there for us to digest, and thank you very much for the. I mean, there were two things that struck me, and maybe that's why I'm thinking we probably need something to chew on. I mean, we need a little time to chew on it. It was very powerful, the quotations that you shared and from your interviews, etc., and to try and really see and live in the shoes of women within their workplace. I think that was really important. And then the other thing I think that was really important, certainly for us, is about how you've connected foodwork with breastfeeding, specifically in relation to how women's bodies are being regulated in this construction in a very specific way. So when you think about the breast as best, so that's the so-called scientific knowledge, and then who then has to implement this practice without able to understand the unequal structural situation that women have to find themselves in. So thank you very much. I see, yes, great work, and enjoy learning more about your presentation. I'm wondering if anybody has a specific question, so that I don't continue to chat with you, Feranaaz, because this is an area that I work in, so I'm trying to hold back a little. Anybody? Is there a question that you have that you'd like to take on? But perhaps while people are thinking about it, perhaps you could say something about this point about women's bodies as how they get regulated, how the stigma happens, etc., specifically in relation to the breastfeeding. So I think it would be useful for you to maybe just share a little more about that, and then how you connect it directly to how food work gets constructed in the context of breastfeeding.
Okay, so really in the low-income work context, any work context really, but particularly the low-income workplace, there's generally not a lot of it's not really a conducive environment for women to breastfeed often. You know, there's no real environment in terms of a private facility to breastfeed, and in terms of working hours as well. So this means that women are often breastfeeding in the bathroom to hide the fact that they are breastfeeding. They don't want employers to know that they are breastfeeding. As you saw from that one quote, you know, having a bottle of milk in a freezer where other employees could see was seen as very taboo and inappropriate. So it's this idea that, you know, the breasts are something that are private and it shouldn't be in a public environment like a workplace, particularly in the low-income work context where there's even more of a stigma in terms of lack of access and an environment that's conducive to breastfeeding. In terms of the Foodwork side, what I really found through my study is that Foodwork is really something that a lot of women are responsible for. And in the typical sense, Foodwork is something that kind of has a lot of technical aspects to it in terms of preparing the food, considering dietary requirements, considering the budget and how you balance that when you're feeding a family. However, there's greater complexity when you look at it as breastfeeding as an aspect of Foodwork, in that mothers need to be able to understand why their infant is crying, why they could be rejecting the breast milk, or trying to balance breastfeeding and formula feeding at the same time due to working hours. There's also the technical aspects like heating up milk bottles or creating like Foodwork schedules, breastfeeding schedules, especially because like you can see lots of these mothers say, you know, they will even work late, coming in early in the morning. So it's how to ensure that that infant is getting enough food when they're not around as well.
Thank you very much. Maybe two things. Your analysis is fantastic, and you really brought things together. But perhaps if we can connect it to the earlier session today, the breakout session, the plenary session that relation to thinking about what is food, and so perhaps you can speak a little bit to breast milk as food and what that represents and what that looks like. I think that would be really interesting, because I think what people were sharing in the earlier session was that how it's not just nutritional, it has all these other aspects. And what does that mean then? I don't know if you have some thoughts on.
Yeah, so I suppose, like you say, you know, the breast milk is beyond just nutritional value. There's a lot of like I said, there's a lot of like a health perspective that really mandates the breastfeeding is the best kind of Foodwork, and that sort of really shapes mothers' Foodwork techniques and what type of feeding options they choose. Like I said, there's definitely the technical aspects of the breastfeeding in terms of making sure that the infant is been fed at the right hours, the right amounts, and ensuring that there's also that care, and there's, you know, Foodwork also goes, and food in general goes beyond just this idea of giving somebody food for sustenance, but it's about showing a loving relationship, showing that sort of emotional connection, and showing that, you know, you've really thought about that individual quite carefully, and considered their needs. You know, lots of these mothers talk to how at some point they knew when to stop breastfeeding, and they knew when the child needed to switch from breast milk to other types of foods based off their reactions and how they were engaging with the infant. So I think with breastfeeding especially, there's definitely that emotional connection that transcends it just beyond food and nutrition to a relationship building exercise, really.
Thank you very much. I thought just, I've been told that we've got a minute over time, but just, I mean, I think maybe just to, so that it's a little more clearer, certainly for myself, is not the idea that breasts are best, but rather that there's a social construction around breast milk, and then what are the different things in relation to women, working class women, in relation to this notion of breast milk as best. That's the one thing. And I think the other thing that you said so well earlier was problematizing the fact that there's a whole set of structural things that are linked to breastfeeding, which I think is really, really critical. So it's not just that, you know, health and nutrition say breast is best, but rather to be able to say, well, actually, what does breast is best mean really in the context work and Foodwork, and who has that sort of, who holds that burden. Thank you very much. We'll try and pick that up at the end. Is that okay?
No, that's fine.
Thank you very much. Do you have a last comment for us?
Yeah, I think also just like a follow-up comment maybe to what you said, that I think I just also like to emphasize is really looking at how it's in the context of local knowledge systems, and while breastfeeding may be this medical perspective as well, because we all understand what the health benefits are, it's also done in a context where it's hard to always only breastfeed based on your situation, and it's recognizing that there are other sorts of knowledge and systems, particularly in an African context, particularly in South Africa, where things have healing properties like water, or other types of things that women really look towards, and to involve both the breastfeeding with their culture as well, and not just have this purely medical notion of breastfeeding.
Thank you. Hopefully, Feranaaz, we can connect it later to Tinashe in the point that you're making about situated knowledge. So what does it mean in the community garden? And what does it mean in the household, and connecting it to this larger project that you're talking about is what am I, which is that it's in fact not a single act, and in fact it's a community act, and how to think about that in the socialization of that. Thank you very much. I'm going to move us along. Thank you. So colleagues, we're going to move on to Tjale. Are you here with me, Tjale? Who's going to be sharing with us, the presentation title is Perceptions of Women Street Food Vendors on the Determinants of Competitiveness of Street Food Enterprises, a mouthful, in the rural town, and specifically the Limpopo province. But I'm really looking forward to your presentation. It's interesting for me that they've put me together with you and Feranaaz and Tinashe. Each area is a place that I've been. So this particular district I'm very familiar with. So I'm really looking forward to this. Welcome. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm Mahopo Cloupas. So I'll be presenting my paper. It's part of my PhD program. So I'll be presenting the perception of street food vendors on the determinants of competitiveness of the street food enterprises in the rural towns of Vhembe district in the Limpopo province. So as we all know that street food vending is one of the essential contribution to employment, more especially for household revenue and food security in developing countries. So a lot of studies have been conducted in South Africa that they've realized that there is an increase in street food vending. So leading to one of distribution of enormous variety of products like fruits, vegetables, and many other ready-to-eat foods that are sold in the streets. And one of the characteristics that we normally regard, we name the street food vendors, is that the street food vendors, they normally get, they are unable to get regular jobs in the remunerative formal sector, and they are associated with having low education and skills. We all know that no institutional or infrastructural support that is being given to the street food vendors, which is one of the issues of concern in South Africa and elsewhere. So these challenges, they make it difficult for the street food vendors enterprise to be competitive. So amongst these challenges that are being identified are the perceived business operation, the knowledge, extortion related, and production inputs that are critical issues for the business competitiveness that needs to be considered, of which they are problematic. Also, one of the issues are the market price fluctuations that are making these enterprises to be not competitive. Amid these challenges, skilled South African opt for informal trading due to high unemployment. So you could see that these people who are even skilled, they even shift to do informal trading because of employment. So in this study, we used a Potter's diamond model to look into what is it that can be done for the street food vendors to be competitive. So the Potter's model has got 6 attributes that they've used for an enterprise to be competitive, which are the chains, factor conditions, the firm strategy, the demand, government also, and other supporting industries that works together with an enterprise to be competitive. So we are trying to look into the street food vendors, if whether this model will also be feasible for the street food enterprises. Hence, the current study will investigate the perception of street food enterprises on the determinants of the street food vendors. So this study was a cross-sectional, where the population and size were street food vendors selling only cooked food. A sample of 511 street food vendors were conveniently sampled to participate in this study, where from 3 towns, which are Makhado, Musina, and Thohoyandou. Most of the municipalities did not have records or a number of street food vendors who are selling cooked food. So the study used a walkthrough survey where we interviewed those who we conveniently met in the streets to participate, in order so we could be able to characterize the street food vending, which is one of the other topic of the main study. So, but for now, we are going to focus on the perceptions. Several institutions were visited in order to get, permission to conduct the study, and approvals were granted. Objectives, aim were explained to the street food vendors before we could even interview them. So I had 9 field workers where we used a structured questionnaire consisting of the demographic and the Potter's model, where we used a 5-point Likert scale to determine the perceptions. 1 was regarded as strongly disagree, and the highest, which is 5, strongly agree. Let me not, okay, what can I say? We use a score of 3.5 to determine if whether to rate the perceptions based on the 6 attributes. So our findings were that majority of the street food vendors were in the Thohoyandou town and were never married. And in our study, we found that most of the participants were obviously South Africans, with Zimbabweans taking part as street food vendors. And then they had some high school education, but could also see that 0.8 had degrees. And we had full owners as the majority of the street food vendors. If you look at the age distribution, majority of them, almost 50, they were between 35 and 45 years. And obviously there were females, while of which very few youth participated in the study. And then we also determined the economic profile of street food vendors, where the mean household income was 7,000, with 6,000 made from the business. And this enterprises, they support at least close to 2, sorry about the lights, they support almost 2 or 1 male family members. Now, with regard to the perceptions, we looked into those 6 attributes, of which the first one was the production factors. The street food vendors, they considered the production inputs as important for their enterprises to strive, One of the issues that they perceived was water, infrastructure, and capital as costly. They do not have any savings. They are not supported when it comes to infrastructure. They just put a tent somewhere there and do their businesses. And then demand and related supporting industries, like I had indicated, 3.5 was regarded as a mean that we consider as important. But then the demand condition and related and supporting industries were not regarded as important in this in street food vendors. They mostly perceived government role as one of the important issues to consider for their business to strive or to be competitive. There was poor support and interaction amongst street vendors and the government. And street food vendors' perception of firm strategies, structure, and rivalry. Even this one, it was not regarded as that important. So what was regarded as important here was also the price stability. Now, of all the identified factors, we had to rate the most perceived factors. So there are three attributes or factors that were considered, which were the role and chains. So we rated which ones were which one was the most important: water, natural factors, which is climate condition, disaster, insufficient sources of water, where they don't have a source of capital or capital is costly, no support from government. Crime was also one of the issues that were considered very important for them to say our business will strive or will be competitive. So now, the model of competitiveness of the street food vendors has shown three attributes, as I've indicated, which are the factor condition, chains, the role of government. These were the mostly considered factors for the business to be competitive. And then they were uncertain about the other conditions, the firm demand related and supporting industries. Based on the attribute 10 influential factors, as I've indicated, they were identified as the ones that could be used to increase competitiveness of the street food vendors, as portals are too broad. Now, the street food vendors were unable to operate in climatic conditions. They had lack of availability and costly capital, lack of access to finance or capital in small enterprise, businesses. So this was also highlighted in Cape Town. Most of the street food vending studies were highlighted in Cape Town, where street food vendors, they don't have support from either government or any industry or institution. So they rely on their own savings to establish. They do not have support when it comes to infrastructure, water, and all that. So the current study showed that street food vendors depend daily on their own sales, on their own making. So by producing some inputs to maximize profit could also make sure that these enterprises are competitive. As indicated in the Potter's Diamond model, we suggest that developing skills could assist in the competitiveness of the enterprises. So the current study showed high level of food vendors with some form of high school education, meaning that if these people are given some trainings, it could assist in ways that their business, their enterprises could be sustainable. Water was one of the issues. Government, as I've indicated, was one of the main issues that was perceived by street food vendors as a problem. And chains regarding could be politics, diseases, crime, and all that. where street vendors, they've considered this as one of the important factor among street food enterprises for them to be competitive. And women in the current study were in the majority and found to be victims of crime in the area. Also, due to the gender-based violence in the country, women do not feel safe in their own space. You could see that the enterprises that are just there, they're isolated, and at times they even work late hours. So there's no one to support them, to be there with them as they are doing their sales. So criminals could come at any time to either take their stock, the money, or whatsoever. So in conclusion, investment of the street food enterprise in Vhembe district could be based on its competitiveness. So for this enterprise to be competitive on production conditions, natural and government role, those are the ones that can be prioritized to make sure that the street food vending enterprise is competitive. It is crucial to make street food vendor to acquire more training for them to come up with their own strategies to improve their businesses. So a comprehensive approach is needed when appraising the suitability of street food vending. So it could be government, private, and the street food vendors themselves. So a formal representation of government through municipal and organized teams among the street food vendors could help the government to play a role in the enterprise, as it was perceived as one of the most important issues. So I thank you. Any contribution is welcome.
Hi, thank you
Hello.
very much. You were very disciplined about your time. Thank you very much. I see there's some claps there for you, etc., which is great. There's a question for you also by Anonymous. If I knew who Anonymous was, I'd ask them to come to ask their question. Anonymous, do you want to come and be at the table and ask your question, or is it okay that we just read it out and reply? Tjale, do you see it? Okay. Tinashe, can you bring Tinashe quickly to the screen, to the main table, please? Tinashe, are you here? Can you ask your question? Let me just, sorry, I'm apologies everybody. Okay, the question is, apologies. The specific question was maybe two things before the specific question. The one was, thank you very much for your presentation. There was a lot of information and a lot of data. So I think we need a little more time to actually explore and look at it. So that's the one thing. But thank you very much. And maybe two things. The one is I was interested, maybe you said it and I missed it, but I was interested to know, what is the street food? Like, what is the actual street food? That's the one. And then is, maybe to speak about, say something a little bit about what is the street food, and where, you said women are the main drivers of that process. But you didn't maybe share a little bit about the informal economy, how they get to be there. So I think that it would be really interesting, perhaps, if you could just say something about that. And immediately I was thinking about the informal and formal economy, and then what I hear you suggesting in your recommendations is about integrating them in a formal way. And so maybe speak then to what is the complexity about the formalization. Is that their desire, or can there be support without formalization? So it's the nature of the municipality, so to speak. So just maybe thinking about that, which links to Anonymous's question, maybe. Were there different perceptions around the role of local as opposed to other types of government support, example, provincial, national, in your study? I was hoping that the person could ask the question because I wasn't quite clear about it. But maybe you can speak to what I asked you, if that's okay, Tjale.
Okay. When we talk of street food, we are basically talking of foods that are cooked in the street and sold in the street. They are mostly at a lesser price, and they normally regard them as unhealthy foods. So, but that it's not only not all street food that are cooked in the street that are regarded as unhealthy, but they are traditional foods that are cooked in the streets. They are just fatty foods that are cooked in the streets. Those who could regard them as unhealthy, and the other unhealthy foods could be that they are prepared in the street in an environment that is not environmentally friendly. Yes, and the other thing you said, women are the drivers of the street foods. This could be because generally, women cook food at home, and then men they do not feel, or they're not interested in selling food in the street, maybe because of our pride or maybe something else. And then you asked something about the informal economy. Can you come again with regard to that?
In your presentation at the end, you speak about the types of support. What are the obstacles? And you speak about water, you speak about local government not being able to support, etc. But I wanted to locate the idea also of street food within the informal economy, because that's why it doesn't. You have to get a permit to be on the street. I recall in that particular area, lots of harassment around having a permit and not having a permit. So that sort of regulation wasn't something that you spoke about. So I was just talking about if it is to recognize women's street food vendors into the system, it's then into the formal system, right? Is what I'm understanding you to say. And then what are the implications? Is that something that they've said that they're interested in doing or not?
The challenges that
you have a lot of data there. So I'm wanting to know, have you had a conversation with them and what are they saying?
Of course, each and every enterprise informal street food vendor would like to be recognized. But because of the structure of the municipality and our government, so far they are not anywhere to be recognized because of the nature of the business. But what I've noticed now, it's in Cape Town, where there are some establishments where Cape Town, they are trying to bring the informal economy on board. Unlike in this site where informal economy, they're not even considering, they are not even talks of possibilities to say, let's bring the informal economy on board. So there are very minimal chances of saying we could put these enterprises in order to come on board. So hence the study was conducted to see what is it that could be done for this street food, to start with this small group, those who are cooking food only. Then maybe at a later stage, it could be extended to other enterprises.
Thank you. I'm not going to speak about this idea around competitiveness, etc., because I'll digress us. But I think what's really important as well is linked to the question that one of the Tinashe is asking, but specifically in how you phrase the informal and street food and the definitions of street food. And so within that definitions of street food is the stigmatization of healthy and unhealthy food. And I think that that's really important to see and think about, because when we think about the formal restaurants, they're just restaurants, right? Nobody's saying this is, they're not being stigmatized, whether they have a burger their thing, or whether they and then there's also the question around sanitization, etc., and what's hygiene and what's not hygiene, and that ties very much to Feranaaz's point earlier about the breast milk in the fridge, that there's all these connotations which come with formalized health and nutrition to talk about what's healthy food, what's nutritional, what's sanitized, which is all in the formal domain. So I think that maybe you want to say something to that, if you don't mind. And then the other thing perhaps to say, to ask you, is linked to this idea of the indigenous, the street food that's being made, and is it local? Local in the sense of however you want to describe local. Is it food that is? I think and I haven't done the study, but my own experience of being in that area is that the food is very specific to that area, whether you want to call it unhealthy or not healthy. But there's something that's connected there. So maybe you could say something to that. And then the last thing is, are they being organized to address some of the challenges that they are facing?
Okay. The other thing is we as customers also, we perceive as the foods that they are selling, they are not healthy because of the environment where they are. But if you go and check what they do, the whole process, the stages of food preparation, you will notice that, of course, there are some loopholes during the stages of food preparation. But in a nutshell, the foods are healthy. And the other thing is, what they are cooking is the traditionally or the local foods, like a pap or meat and one veg. What we could be concerned of is if whether they are nutritionally adequate or not. But the safety, some studies have indicated that there's low bacterial load in the food that are sold in the street, because they don't spend much time on the table, or they just cook and chill and serve. So the chances of the bacterial loads and the likes, they are very minimal. Some studies have also looked into that. Yeah, I think if I've forgotten something else.
No, that's fine. Please have a look at the chat and the questions and answers as well, so that you can have an opportunity. But thank you very much. I think what's really interesting, certainly from your presentation, and then maybe Tinashe, you can come back onto the stage, as well as all of us can just be here, the presenters, if you can come back onto the stage, is this conception of how food and nutrition linked to regulation, linked to formal economy, linked to the formal market, etc., is all conceived in a very modern way, isn't it? It's all constructed.
Yes.
This is modern, and what is modern is linked to a very particular notion of sort of Western construction of what the market looks like, what the food garden looks like, what breastfeeding looks like, etc. So that's just another point to make. Thank you very much for coming back onto the screen. There were a couple of questions I asked you to have a look in the chat and the Q&A, and I'm going to give you each a few minutes to reply and make a comment. And if there's anybody else in the room, I know Lynn on the chat works a lot on street vending as well, street food. I see, who else do I see? I see many people here. I see, yeah, I'm looking down the names. I see many people here that are thinking about this question about informal and formal economy as well. So they're not asking their questions, but I think they have posed some questions, and you're most welcome to reply. I'm fading now. That's because it's lunchtime for me, and I wouldn't be eating nutritional food or non-nutritional food. I'd be eating food for joy and for pleasure because I'm hungry right now. So please go ahead. Whoever like to go, you can.
Okay, maybe the other thing that we need to note in this presentation is that the informal street food vending is there to serve a purpose. in most cases, we cannot all afford to buy food from the restaurants. And this serves to the rural individuals who are coming to rural towns, who one person could have 20 rands or 30 rands to buy a plate so that they do not go hungry when they are in town. Unlike going into a restaurant where it costs more than maybe 100 rands, the minimum that I've looked at, a plate. So, and foods that are sold in the streets, like I've indicated, they are well balanced. They do have all the food groups. We normally talk of 6 food groups. It might be only 1 or 2 that is not there, but most of the food groups are there. So it serves a purpose. So hence I'm saying the street food enterprises needs to be looked at in such a way that there's much support given to them so that they could improve how they do things, to at least to meet the Department of Health standards of a healthy environment, healthy foods, and all that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very important point that you make. Thank you. Feranaaz, over to you.
I just want to comment a bit on Pralini's point. She also noted, and she said, breast also comes from a very privileged sense. And I think that there's quite a lot to unpack in terms of that. And, some of which I did mention is one in terms of the sort of inequalities that women are experiencing, which makes it hard to only breastfeed. Like I said, it's coming from a sense where they're the only caregivers, where they're single parents, where they are working difficult hours, which make it hard to do that. And also, like, the second perspective, which I also introduced, was also this idea that it's these women's knowledge that also isn't been accepted. In this health discourse, breastfeeding is posited to be the best type of food work. However, these women also have their own knowledge systems and their own advice and community values, and it's important to also recognize that this is coming in a context where you can't say purely because breastfeeding is best for the infant that you can't acknowledge women's knowledge in this and their decision as well. And that, in terms of literature, also links to the feminist perspective of breastfeeding and the feminist perspective of the health discourse. And it's this idea that while breast is best in terms of nutritional value, there's also more to consider. So it's important to also consider the influence of these women's material realities, their knowledge systems, their own agency over their body, and their decision that they can choose their own techniques and what they perceive to be best as well. So I don't think it's about denying the whole perspective of breastfeeding. It's definitely there. There's a lot of value for both the mother and for that infant, but it also goes beyond that to look at the context that these women are in and their own local knowledge that they can choose to follow if they want to.
Very much. I think that, I'm not sure if you saw is comment, which is a really, really important comment, which is also about thinking about this connection between breastfeeding and motherhood and how that gets normalized and naturalized, and also from a feminist perspective, what sort of response is there to that. So I think that that's also important. Maybe you can just have a look at his comment, and then I'll give you 30 seconds to reply after I go to you, Tinashe. There were lots of comments there for you. I hope you. I said to Tinashe, he's got 3 minutes to string it together. Go ahead, Tinashe.
Thank you, Donna. I think the main issue, or I can pick up from the comments, is the issue of policies and where the state comes in when it comes to the support of not just urban community gardens, but urban agriculture in general. So what I would say to that is, because I'm looking at this from a capitalist or like a neoliberal environment perspective, it's quite clear that the state only chips in to support these activities within that mindset where we're saying every societal problem should be individualized. So if you don't have food, it's your fault. You should be the one who goes to plant or grow something and sell it, and assume that's the same thing, even in like street vending, like do something on your own, be entrepreneurial, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of contradictions as there are with capitalism, even in this issue. So they're saying go in and cultivate, but they are not providing sufficient land for the gardeners, right? So what does this mean? It means that these gardeners have to look for small pieces of land or cultivate as backyard gardeners and so forth. And what this has done, perhaps most detrimental, is force the gardeners to cultivate food crops that they do not necessarily consume, but they cultivate these food crops because they want to sell them out. They want to sell the produce and generate some income. So at the end of the day, you have a situation where the gardeners are cultivating foodstuffs which they don't consume, but are consumed in wealthier neighborhoods. So the nutrition is actually going out of the townships to some extent. And that's where the issue of organization becomes important. Because as those farmers organize and try and share ideas and cultivate a certain mentality, I think that's the only way in which they can counter, the way the state, and if it's so, civil society is complicit to some extent in these issues, because they do support or promote the growing of high value crops. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what I would say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question in relation to high value crops and support, but also right at the beginning of your presentation, you made this point, and I think it would be useful for you, for each person actually on the panel, to return to this. But you made this point that the food gardening is not only the community garden is not only about food production. If you remember, you said there are multiple reasons. So I think it would be really important for you to, sort of make a complete circle to the nature of the panel that the three of you are on, which is called Humanizing Food Justice Politics. So I think that if you could speak to maybe one or two of those other dimensions in the same way that Tjale spoke to why the street vendor is also really important. Street food vendor is really also important. It's not just only for the food, but it's also a particular way of being in the world, which is that you can't afford a restaurant or something like that. So I think that was also a really important aspect that he brought. Feranaaz?
Thanks, Donna. I know we're a bit rushed for time, but I'll just say one just thank you to
We'll be disciplined, but we'll be feminists. We've got 1 minute and we'll stretch that 1 minute. So don't feel rushed.
Well, thank you to Tinashe for the comment. I think it's given me a lot to also think about and reflect on. And yeah, I definitely agree in terms of the common sensing, and the fact that breastfeeding is something that's sort of become normalized, and that's just the way to go, because there's this idea that breastfeeding is best. So it also doesn't leave a lot of place for many choices when you're getting this imaging that this is the only way to go. It also leaves gaps in what other choices mothers have, and that's why I sort of said, lots of the mothers, when they spoke to how they were almost inundated with this messaging that breast is best, but they didn't know why it was. And it's like, you're not giving the full picture, so you're not letting somebody make that full choice. Do they want to go the traditional way, or how can they fit in their own values and their own knowledge systems into the act of breastfeeding, if it really is the best choice for that woman and her body?
Very much. This is fantastic. I hope that when we leave, you still get to see all these fantastic comments in the chat. I'm sorry to everybody that we haven't done justice to your really important comments, but I'm going to give each of you just 30 seconds just to, say your last word, and then we're going to close so that we can all have a comfort break before the next session. Go ahead.
Okay, maybe I could just respond to the anonymous to say, generally, there is no support that is given to the street food vendors, either provincially, nationally, or what. So the perceptions that we see in this study is the local perception of the role of the municipality, where there's no support given to the street food vendors. Same as what is happening with the food gardens. they are occupying land illegally, and hence you see them. They don't even have the basic and necessary needs. I mean, like water, infrastructure, and the likes. So, of which, after this study, the plan was that I will have to make sure that I will do some meetings with the street food vendors and the relevant stakeholders to see what is it that can be done, possibly done, to help the street food vendors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can tag on to Tinashe's point, which is actually they're reclaiming land. And the previous presentation, which is not about looting or being illegal or etc., but rather reclaiming land, which I like the way you phrased that, Tinashe. If that's okay, Tjale. Maybe think of it like
Yes.
that, as opposed to saying like the street vendors are reclaiming their space on the street and not invading the space, and they're taking space away from Pick n Pay, as opposed to more space being given to Pick n Pay.
They're just in front of Pick n Pay, where they obscuring, I mean, pedestrians to move freely. So that's one other issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Feranaaz.
Thanks, Donna. I think just as a last comment, I'd like to just respond to Lynn. And she asked about, is there a need to advertise breastfeeding? And I think really based also on one of the person's quotes, it's about how you advertise it. There's a lot of advertising for it, but if you're only advertising as breast is best, and that's problematic. If you're only advertising is that is in English and it's not in, and it's written on a piece of paper or on a poster, but it's not somewhere that the knowledge can be transferred, and it's not transferred carefully, then that's problematic. So it's not so much about there is one a need to advertise it, but it's more important like how you advertise it. Advertising it in local newspapers and local radios and local TV shows in languages that people can understand, so that they can understand why breast is best, but why your knowledge also counts. So I think it's been very careful about how you advertise breastfeeding and moving away from purely just breast is best, just to help perspective, to more of a collaborative advertising, really.
Thank you very much. And perhaps maybe just to push that a little further, Feranaaz, if that's okay, which is also that it shouldn't be any advertising, because there's lots of advertising, actually too much advertising in a particular way, and certainly not if it's going to be reinforcing that it's women's job to carry this burden, and certainly not if the advertising reinforces this particular social reproductive role that women have to have, an unfair burden without thinking about the structural consequences, which is what you've raised so really well in terms of race, class, and gender, about the point that Prelenia makes about it seems then breast is best as a privileged, just like slow food, privileged for certain people. So I think that's also really important. Thank you very much. Tinashe? Can you please don't forget, say something about your first point, which was gardening as a form of activism, and then very importantly, the point about quiet activism, and the silent aspect of that.
Okay, thank you. Just to round up, I would like to appreciate, all the presenters, because I think what's quite clear across all the presentations is the fact that, there is politics in food. Like, it's not just about perhaps what you see from the surface, but there is always underlying. It's there's a lot to unpack there. And relating to my talk today, that's essentially what it is. Like, when you look at gardening for a long time, what the narrative that has been pushed is it's for household food security and so forth. But when you have in-depth conversations with these gardeners, you then realize that there are multiple reasons. I mean, yes, they could be farming for some income, but it could be also spiritual. It could also be to improve, the greenery in the area and so forth. So I think it's quite important for studies or conversations to also unpack those other elements, and this can help improve our understanding of the place of urban agriculture in the city. And speaking to the point of activism, that's essentially one of the reasons as well. Like, one of the motivations behind why certain people may take up urban agriculture, because essentially these people are backyard gardeners, but the fact that they, in addition to what they're already doing in their backyards, they want to be a part of a community garden and push all these different agendas to serve or address specific issues within the community. It does show that there is intent behind gardening, and indeed we can say gardening is a form of politics, if one can say, and obviously on different scales and in different intensities, but definitely there is politics involved there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it on that last word, because I think we all agree. But thank you very much for the presenters, and thank you everybody for your patience and staying with us. And we apologize you didn't have a chance to raise your voice, but we saw your comments. This was a really insightful conversation, and please, like I reminded you, it's on page 29, humanizing food justice politics. And I think the one thing about the humanizing element of this, which I think all of you point to, but maybe we haven't underscored, but that oftentimes, whether it's food gardening or even your discussion in relation to breastfeeding as food work or street food, and thinking about that, is in fact that there are hands and feet that do this work. And these hands and feet get left out of this discussion. And oftentimes the hands and feet are spoken about in a way which is about to feed themselves in a particular way in relation to food security. In fact, when I listen to your presentations, perhaps to underscore over and over that the humanizing part is in fact that it's so rich what's happening in these community gardens. And when you said, it was so profound to me. If you can just remind us of that, the actual charter, Guguletu Urban Farmers Initiative, house for house, community by community. And you could say that for the street food too, food by food, person by person, and a social way of engaging and being with food, etc. So I think that that's really important, and underscoring the politics of that is really important. Thank you very much to everybody. I'm going to close our session. If everybody else can leave, please. And I'm supposed to remind you to please go to the breakout. No, you're supposed to go to, if you click on the blue on top in front of you, you'll see plenary and breakout room. And you can either go and chat there or say hello there. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else except for my panelists, and I'm going to ask them, oh, yeah, it's breaking for lunch. After lunch, please join us for plenary, the keynote speaker. Can you hear this? Boop, boop? I think there's somebody knocking or saying something in the chat. But thank you very much to everybody for your patience and your time. And I think that this will lead us really well into the next conversation that we're having this afternoon. And to our presenters and the behind-the-scene organization of this, much appreciation to your time and your energy and your presentations. Thank you. If you go to the this wonderful booklet that they've put together, please go to the abstracts there. And if you're wanting to connect with any of the presenters, please send them an email. They're really looking forward to your comments, your contributions, and further engagement. I speak on their behalf. As we're all learning and growing together, and our work intersects. So thank you very much for your patience. Bye. I'm tired now. Bye.